Welcome, everyone, to this week's edition of New Money. I'm Michael Wong. Soccer or football, whatever you want to call it, is the most popular sport in the world. And here in China, of course, the game is all the craze as well. This week, we profile Beijing's very first joint venture amateur football league, trying to bring the game into even more people's lives here. On the program today, China ClubFootball.
It was the summer of 2014. China caught the World Cup fever. China has more football fans than most countries' population. According to state broadcaster China Central Television, over 43 million Chinese viewers watched the 2014 World Cup final at 3 a.m. Beijing time. Zhang Xueli is an amateur football player in Beijing. He is driving 20 kilometers from his home to play a match hosted by Chuancheng Shengshi Football Club. Chuancheng Shengshi has three 11-man grass pitches in Beijing and a semi-professional team of retired players. Their pitches are extensive and located far from the city, so their business is facing a hard time. One of the pitches has already turned into a water park.
Right now, we're still in the red. As you can see, we have big pitches to take care of, and the maintenance costs are pretty high. And that's just a small part of it. We're still working to become more visible and receive more support from the government.
Zhang Xueli's team mainly consists of a group of friends who like to play football, and most of Chuancheng's fewer than 200 members learned about the club through word of mouth. But there's no lack of amateur players in Beijing, and the club hopes to arrange more amateur leagues.
We don't have that many leagues. We need someone to set them up, someone who can make all the arrangements and prepare all the fields and so on. Someone needs to take the lead. That's the key.
At 6 p.m., most people in Beijing are on their way home from work. But for Yang Tao, the workday has only begun. Yang is ClubFootball's pitch manager and on his way to Chaoyang Athletics Park to prepare the club's summer league.
A lot of Chinese like to play football with foreigners, and we're kind of unique in that respect. We post the results the day after each game. This way, the teams can follow the ranking, and for the second half of the league, whether they will advance or not. The top two teams are promoted, while the bottom two are relegated.
During the league games, the athletic park turns into a melting pot of players and spectators from every corner of the world.
The ClubFootball League is very professional, and it uses an international ranking system. The participating players are very friendly, and they're passionate about the sport.
In
Japan, one day of five-side games costs 1,000 yuan to 1,500 yuan. Here, I pay only 100 yuan for the entire season.
It's
an amateur club, but the setup is very professional. It's great that amateur players can get a feeling of playing in a professional league. I've played for 5 or 6 years now, and I think there are more and more teams participating, both foreign and Chinese. There's more teams joining every year.
ClubFootball's main office occupies a 200 square meter office in Beijing's northeast side. The company has 20 employees, but doesn't own any big pitches and hasn't yet attracted any big investors. Yet profits and the number of members are on the rise.
And joining us to talk about China ClubFootball is Professor Jia Ning, Deputy Director at the China Business Case Center at Tsinghua University. Professor, thank you as always for joining us. So before talking specifically about China ClubFootball, which is a manager of amateur football leagues here in Beijing, one of several, let's talk about amateur football clubs in general, because the club that we interviewed, the manager there said that his club is still in the red. He's trying to get market attention, get the government to help out a little bit more. Right. What do you think is the cost structure for amateur football clubs here in China?
Right. Well, that's a good question. Let's take a look at CCF's cost structure. Actually, the cost is comprised of three components. The first component is the staffing cost. Basically, that's salary paid to the soccer coaches as well as other employees on the company's payroll. That's about 30% of the entire cost structure. And another big chunk is actually rental. So it's the office rental plus the pitch rental. This is combined is about 40% of the entire cost. And a third component is actually promotion and publicity. That's another 15%. And of course, they also have miscellaneous costs, which is another 10 to 15%, right? So from this pie chart, what we see here is the single largest cost item for CCF is office and pitch rental, right? And as we've seen from the video clip, this company currently doesn't own any big pitches. Instead, they rent them. And upside of rental is that it basically enables Club China to take advantage and utilize these pitches without having to commit a significant upfront investment cash outlay. But at the same time, the downside of leasing is that if the rental price needs to be renegotiated frequently, then it will introduce significant uncertainty to the company's cost structure and the entire financial performance over time.
So, Professor, this is a very interesting business model, I would say. China ClubFootball is a professional manager of an amateur football league, right? Talk to us about some of the pros and cons of this business model.
Well, sure. I think a major upside to its business model is that it sets quality standards. So even though these amateur football players are not pros and they don't have the opportunity to play in professional games, but nevertheless, they do have true passion for footballs and they want to experience what it feels like to be playing at the professional level. So I think the closer the CCF is able to mimic that professional experience, the more attractive its service will be, and the players will be more willing to pay for that kind of service. So that's the upside. But of course, if you were to run professionally of these amateur club, the downside is that, well, it's going to cost you more and you have to pay a lot more attention to details, which is going to be difficult to do.
You know, Professor, when we spoke to the chairman of China ClubFootball, he says that still there are no big investors looking at his company right now. And we know that CCF began operations all the way back in the early 2000s. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think CCF is still in the stage of organic growth. That means the company is trying to expand and grow, using its internal resources and capital. Generally speaking, company following this particular strategy tends to grow slower compared to companies that take on external investors and use that capital for M&A, merger and acquisitions. But nevertheless, we still see a lot of startup companies with organic growth, and I think there are two reasons for that. One is the founder's own preference. Sometimes the founder just doesn't want to bring on external investors because introducing new investor into a company will create a series of new issues such as dilution and loss of ownership control of the company. And another possible explanation is, even if a founder wants to bring on external investors, he or she may not be able to do that, successfully attract investors. When it comes to deciding whether or not to invest in a particular project, the investor will oftentimes look at the potential market share as well as the growth trajectory of the company. Now, but we know that for startup companies, they usually grow faster, in the early days of their life, and the growth will decline over time. Right? A good example would be Google. So on this first screen, what we're seeing is actually Google's revenue build up between year 2001 and up to 2007. And if you look at it, it's a very rosy picture in the sense that we do see a significant increase in Google's revenue over the 6 years period. But on the next screen, what we're seeing is actually the Google's revenue growth rate, which is a percentage change in Google's revenue between 2 consecutive years. If you look at this picture, this is a much less rosy picture.
Yeah. Yeah.
So instead of seeing an exponential increase in the growth rate, we are seeing an exponential decline in the growth rate. Right? So as the company gets bigger and bigger, it's just harder to maintain the same growth rate. Right?
Base
so
is larger.
Exactly. Right? It's simple math. So for Club China, CCF, well, the company has been around for 10 years, as you mentioned, and there's no sign of significant growth. So I think for this company, it may be difficult to attract big investors in the near term.
Right. Well, it has been some 10 plus years, and CCF does want to expand. It's got the cost structures that you mentioned. Can it sort of get down the rental costs and the leasing costs, because it is occupying a huge part of its expenses right now? Perhaps after it gets that down, maybe some outside investors can look at it a little bit more. Professor, I want to thank you for that part of our discussion. So we talked about the cost structure of club football, but what about the company's top line? Up next, we zoom in on one particular facet of club football's revenue driver. That's sponsorships. With a limited set of big-name investors right now, should the company instead bank on sponsorships to drive the amateur league forward? Stay with us.